Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. My name is Bartosz Radzikowski. I am the chief economist at Polskie Towarzystwo Gospodarcze, and I'm very honored to have our special guest today, Professor PEDRO VIDELA. Professor PEDRO VIDELA is a professor of economics at Yale Business School. He leads the Department of Economics. Yes. Holds PhD from University of Chicago, and you collaborated with many institutions, you advised government. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and we can talk a little bit about what's happening in the world right now.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, well, we live in a very uncertain times. Now we start with COVID, then we have like Ukrainian war, tensions in the Middle East, and all of this is also, we are also facing big questions about European competitiveness right now, like what is the future for Europe, because we lost competitiveness, or we are losing competitiveness towards US on Asia. So, Pedro, what do you think, is this period of stability which we observed over the last decades is coming to an end? And is it the global economy is entering a new structural area?
Yes, you're totally right by using the word uncertain, meaning we are not going to a risky world where we know the distribution of outcomes. We are going into uncertainty where we don't know the distribution of outcomes. Because we are, for example, now facing a war. We don't know if this war, some people claim that is the starting of the third world war, which will be very problematic, but we no doubt that we have a profound change on the structure that was built in the Western countries after the Second World War. They are the Western countries, led by United States, create a system of international organizations and rules that lasted roughly until 2008. So after the Second World War, they have the creation of the Marshall Plan to rescue and recover Europe. They have a system of setting the dollar as the main currency with the IMF and all. And then we have the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, that later became the WTO, that allowed the expansion of trade, the globalization. Yeah. Then in 1990, the wall came down. 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared, and then that continued this process of expansion. In the meantime, in 1980, China enters to this process. Okay. And by 2001, he joins WTO. So if you take into account 1991 to 2008, it's the time of the fastest growth in the world, because the Soviet Union disappeared, the Cold War disappeared, and we all engaging in trade. Poverty almost disappeared. The world became more equal, not unequal as people claim. So we have a world becoming more equal, and everything ends in 2008, essentially for many reasons. One of the reasons is what we fool ourselves, meaning with all this process of growth, we thought that Russia, that China are going to embrace the liberal values of the Western countries. That didn't happen. Yeah. Although there were a clear signal that won't happen, we fool ourselves, and we tend to believe that this will continue. And second, in 2008, we have the huge recession. Was the first year since 1938 that the global GDP decreases, and they are the people of Western economies, they start questioning the system. They say this system that provides so many goodies, that eliminate poverty, why the system cannot save me, that I'm working all day long to buy a house, to do any saving banks, any saving other things. So that's where we start the process reverting. So if you ask an economist what is the second half of last century, it's very likely that the economy will point 1946, because that's when GATT and trade start until 2008. That's the second half of last century. Since then, we have Donald Trump, we have Xi Jinping, we have pandemic. The world changed dramatically. So we went from a world that is a positive sum game and a world where we live today that at best it's a zero-sum game, but we are with huge uncertainty that maybe might be a negative-sum game.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. And maybe let's fast forward to what we have today, what we have the present situation, because especially here in this region in Central Eastern Europe, we thought that Ukrainian war is something that will end soon. Especially it will end before another war started, but what you already see is the Middle East crisis and Iranian war. And you know, as we know, Middle East is a hub for a global energy supply, right? And with the current war in Iran, many economists are asking whether this could be a potential negative supply shock for the economy, and how this imply, you know, the global economy 2026 and going forward.
Well, there are two things. First, what people are calling this time the second Cold War, not by chance, because that means that what everybody has in mind is we are in a conflict. We have enemies, new enemies. So we have a new, from the Western perspective, axis of evil that is China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But some of the BRICS might go into that one also. So this is a new axis of evil. And in this new world of zero-sum games, we will have proxy war. That's what we call Cold War. So the big guys will never face each other, as it happened in the previous Cold War. So that's why we have Cold War. One is the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. That's a Cold War, a proxy war of this Cold War. Then we have Israel against Iran. We have in Africa, we have also some Cold Wars going on today. Now, what United States has claimed, and this is what we have, United States has claimed, look, Europeans, the Ukrainian is your war. We are going to take care of other wars. We cannot go be everywhere. So we are going to go now. First, we set up the pattern in the Western Hemisphere. We went to Venezuela. Trump and people claim that the United States did that mostly for the oil, but the oil is irrelevant. Actually, it's heavy oil. It's not very important. To rebuild that will take decades to rebuild Venezuela's ability. But the main reason there is to tell the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians, get out from here. This is my backyard.
We are powerful.
Yes, so this you cannot be here. Okay. So let's get out from here. And that will happen in Cuba. United States don't doing anything. Cuba will die by inefficiency of the system, but you will see dramatic change in other countries where the Chinese are heavily involved, meaning Peru, Chile. And also PEDRO from Colombia already went to the White House to say, I'm behaving on Panama, where the both ports at the both end of the canal were run by Chinese companies. Now they are gone. Now there are 3 bases, American bases there. So that's the first thing. The second thing was take care of the issues in the Middle East. And there we had 3 proxy war, inside a war. Instead of having a direct war between Iran and Israel, we have Israel against Hamas, Israel against Hezbollah, Israel against the Houthis. And Israel always wanted to go directly against Iran, which have these 3 groups attacking Israel. So they eliminated the whole Hezbollah. Yeah. Because they have missiles, short-range missiles from the south of Lebanon that they are, and they tried to eliminate that. They went against the Houthis, and now finally they are going against Iran. No, now people claim that maybe this is they say Donald Trump is a puppet of Netanyahu, no? But this going against Iran has, at the end, the goal to free resources to go against the main aim, which is China.
Okay.
So that is where. So what will be the negative supply shock? It can be a profound negative supply shocks if the Strait of Hormuz stop.
Yeah.
And already almost stopped. For how long we stop? No, already stopped, but stopped mostly because the insurance companies didn't want to provide insurance. So now United States pressure all the insurance companies, you have to provide insurance because there is enough oil, there is enough, but that strait that has 20% of the supply of oil, have a supply of gas and everything, if that stop, and the period that stop will have a profound impact on the price of oil. So that is so United States, which is weird because if the Strait of Hormuz stop, the countries that will suffer the most are the Asian countries and China. Okay. China gets almost 30% of its supply of oil from that line. No, Iran was selling 90% of their supply to China, and Iran was selling between 1.3 to 1.4 million barrels per day when they have to, according to all the agreements, they could only sell 300,000, 400,000, and they were, but China and the Asian. But United States, despite that, doesn't want to close that. And why? Because the spike in the price of oil will have a negative impact on United States, not on terms of oil because it's the main producer, but the price of oil will be affected, the country, and we have elections in November. So this is a big problem for the Trump administration. Yeah. The Trump administration don't want to go to that election with people complaining about the price of oil in when they go to pump gas. No, that is something. So, but all this depends how long is the war, and how long if the United States manage to create traffic again by pressuring the insurance company.
Yeah, there's also interesting impact on Russia, for example, because as you say, the increasing price of oil is also something yes. very favorable for Russia yes. because it helps them restore the budget. On the other hand side, I've heard that Iran is also a supplier for Russian military. So the idea to attack Iran was to also yes. partially to have some impact on Russian supplier, which probably gives some tailwinds to Ukrainian war and to Ukrainians who are still fighting. And that's okay, that's interesting. And so just to a little bit maybe sum up this part, I feel that, we both know that we are living in a more and more, let's say, fragmented world. So we probably, I know if we close, but we are moving away from globalizations to more regionalizations. And I'm thinking because, we are in a context of Polish business society, and I was also draw some conclusions for export companies. So what do you think, what could be the, let's say, or how the exporting companies should adapt their strategies in this fragmented world?
Well, all depends. We have a fragmented world. What's the meaning of fragmented world? It's that all the global value chains were going to be restructured. Mm-hmm. We cannot trade with countries that can hurt us geopolitically. We cannot depend in countries that can hurt us geopolitically. Okay. So we are to a fragmentation of the world trade, and this is not something that comes only from Trump. So it doesn't mean that if Trump goes, we will go back to all globalization. No, it's Biden imposed more trade barriers, exporting microchip, for example, to China, that actually the previous government of Trump. It was a secretary of commerce of the Biden administration that coined the term, we are not going to have this day outsourcing, or we are going to have friendshoring. So we are going to have only trade with our friends. So this is a process that is happening and will continue to happen. So multinational has to be very careful where they engage, no? If they are, because the countries, especially United States, would ask, are you with me or against me? And that is it. And that's what's making the trade totally different these days. That's what it's making the negative supply shocks, not only oil, but a permanent one, because now all the production will be more expensive and at a higher price. So what the export companies has to do everywhere, they will have to see which is my set of friends, no? I mean, moving toward China, I'm moving toward United States. Essentially, that's how it's going to be.
So geopolitics shapes economic activity.
Will shape economic activity, and because we were, before economics shaped the value chains, we were producing in the places where they have comparative advantage, was the cheapest way to produce. Now, things that were not last year, 2025, foreign direct investment in China was negative. So people are leaving because they know that when in Liberation Day, that crazy day that Trump put together, when he imposes the tariff that they took out later on China, in one day, Apple capitalization went down almost $1 trillion. So the Apple knows that cannot be there.
Okay.
And people start rearranging this, but that implies that we will produce it at a higher price and less efficient. So it's a stagflation, but long-term stagflation for the world.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Let me switch a little bit more towards Europe, because Europe is our context, and we are very interesting about how the Europe can play in this global game. Because, some people say that, US has big tech, China has manufacturer scale, and Europe has regulation and high energy prices, right? And in this context, what do you think that if Europe have any competitive advantage, what does that be? And what Europe needs to change to remain competitive towards US or Asia?
Well, we have a full report from a year and 3 months from Mr. Draghi that pointed to these issues, no? Yeah. So Draghi says, look, we have a GDP per capita difference between United States and EU that is increasing every year. And 72% of that gap that is created between the GDP per capita of United States versus the European one, 72% is productivity. So we are unproductive. Unproductive means that for each hour we produce less number of goodies. That is, so we have to improve that. So he proposed a huge expenditure on investment and all that type of thing. But when you see the amount that Europe invests, it's not different than the amount that the United States invests. The problem is not investment. The problem is the rest that you just mentioned, regulations and problematics, things that make really cumbersome to produce anything. Among those regulations, now it's becoming clear that they are most inefficient and unnecessary one are those regulations that make the price of energy substantially higher in Europe than in the United States. These regulations were imposed under certain conditions that were going to happen. None of that has happened. Yeah. So now we have that firms, enterprise, and the general public start to asking, hey, you make this huge sacrifice. In some countries, this huge sacrifice were transferred to the extreme of being silly, like in Germany closing 3 nuclear plants.
Yeah.
For what reason? What do you have to show? What you told us that was going to happen has happened. Nothing. So now people will start questioning this, and we hope that that will be reverted, and that will be starting the process of decreasing regulation in Europe. And I close to MBAs constantly, as when they want to do a project and the project is successful and they start to getting money, they move to United States immediately. They know they don't stay here. So this is a problem of having an over-regulated system that doesn't allow it. Now, what is funny though of all this, tragically funny, but funny, is that Mr. Draghi writes 800 pages. He writes about the need to spend more, and in nowhere in that document, that is a very good one, have a case study about Poland, which is the country that have gone from being one of the only country, and I think it's the only country of this century, that became rich. So this is, Poland has now a GDP per capita higher than Spain, so this is a huge group. That's something that has to be taken into account, and none of that is taken into account. So what's happened in this country, why the country being inside the system has been, and the idea that he received money from us, that's not true. Because you can see other countries, and that doesn't happen. So that is not a true reason. So in summary, what's happened to Europe is a big problem. Because essentially, 3 things that were true in the past are not true anymore.
Okay.
First, Europe, maybe the word is too tough, but it's true. Free ride security from United States. United States said, no more free riding.
Yeah.
You will have to go and spend 5% in military expenditure. There are countries like Spain that they spend less than 1.3%, and now they are claiming that they were going to 2% because they are putting there the retirement of the military as a trick to increase it. But this guy, they will have to increase their expenditure. And they will have Mr. Rutte, the head of NATO, say 3% from now, and then we go to 5%. So Europeans will have to come up with the money to protect themselves. First thing. The only country is Poland, by the way, that is expending close to 5%.
We are reaching 5.
They are reaching 5.
This year, 4.8.
Yes, so they're reaching that. So this is, but the other countries, they will have to do it. That will imply that the primary deficits of countries like France, Italy, Spain will push the debt in an unsustainable path. So that's, we have to be careful because interest rate will go up dramatically. We will see how that will resolve. I think that we will come up with more printed money to buy those bonds. So inflation in the euro area will be higher than we will see this time. No? So second, Europe for years lived with energy coming from dictators, from Putin or from the north of Africa.
Okay.
That's gone. So they have to start now to come up with energy sources that won't be that one. And that will be costly. They will have to reassess how they are doing the whole policy into nuclears and et cetera, et cetera. And third, countries like Germany export to China. Now China is competing the goods that Germany used to export to them. And also, part of the Germany comparative advantage was surrounded by neighbors that they used to have low wages, but they became rich. Now they have high wages.
Yeah.
So 33% of the European Union is in big trouble. Yeah. And they have to reassess all this process. So that's why the situation in the European Union is very complicated. The way to solve most of this problem in a less painful way will be to try to create, and this is in Mr. Draghi report, a United States of Europe. Because by doing that, the cost of the debt that will have to increase because they need new expenditure in military and maybe will be lower. If you check the public debt of the United States, the gross public debt is 115%, around that level. The public debt of Europe, aggregate of European Union, it's less than 80%. So they can issue a euro bond that will imply a lower cost of the debt. But in order to do that, Spain, France will have to switch their bonds for the euro bond, and that will decrease the risk of Spanish debt. But at the same time, in order for that to work, Germany will have to switch their bond for the euro bond, and that will increase the risk. So we don't know if there is political will to do that. And secondly, when you look at the political parties that are gaining power in most of the countries in Europe, are not the one that wants more union.
No, for sure.
Are the one that wants split.
Especially that we have the lessons from monetary union,
Yes.
right? That some countries benefit, but some do not benefit. So there is a big debate about it, and more integration is something I think politically it's very difficult to discuss probably today. Specifically, also having in mind, as you mentioned, these lessons from this climate regulation, okay? Because it's also was something that was imposed all over the Europe, and we see that it doesn't work because, as you mentioned, condition has changed, assumption has changed, and there is probably bad memories about it, which are connected to more integration. But one funny thing recently, I've heard about some company visit to China. In China, there was a European business leaders who go to China. And imagine that they were visiting the Chinese companies, and there was a moment when Chinese guys say, sorry, my guest, but you cannot enter this room because you're European, you can steal our technology. So imagine what happened, you know?
It's a reverse from history.
Exactly, it was really a thing. And I'm glad you mentioned Germany, because I would like also to deep dive a little bit on that, because Germany is a very important partner for us. 1/3 of Polish export is linked to Germany, and Germany economy is struggling a lot in recent years. I think they have very flat economic growth, problem with export. So how do you assess the medium-term outlook for Germany in this context?
Well, Germany, if you take the last quarter of 2019, before the pandemic, as 100, and see that's the GDP of Germany there. What is the GDP of Germany today? So 100, the last quarter of 2019. Today, it's 100.5. So the growth in all this period, it's 5 per thousand. That is the growth of Germany. So Germany is in deep trouble, and Germany will have to reassess the regulations and all that type of things. That's why now you see they have a government that is thinking about, again, did we do the right thing, closing the nuclears? So Germany will have to go through a process of opening up to more market and unregulated system. And that will be very difficult, but that's what we have to do, no? But again, the problem is that people usually they find the wrong source of the problem. There is a huge size of the German population that think that the problem are immigrants that are coming there no, the problem that you stay behind in the acquire of new knowledge, stay behind on the acquire of technology that will make the thing simpler. There is a nice book by an ex-FT German guy, editor, that's called Kaput with one T. And this guy said in the book, the problem of Germany is not what they do. The problem is how they do it.
Okay.
So if you look, for example, little things like hours per week work, Germany is at the bottom of Europe. So Germans don't work enough hours, no? But also in the way how they work these few hours is highly inefficient. So that is the reason they have left behind the high school to introduce new technologies for the kids. The kids don't come out with the skills necessary for this new world. It's a tough situation that Germans will have to face, because this is a clear sign that they are staying behind in this. And we don't know how politically that problem. We know what they need to do, but we don't know if there is a politically possibility of doing it. So in the set of what is necessary with the set what is possible, we don't know that there is interaction between these two.
I thought that what we can observe in the press is that Friedrich Merz and the group people around him is quite aware what is happening.
Yes.
They have some will to do it, but of course there's a coalition government, so it all depends on some political, let's say, consensus and how they can make it, right? Okay, interesting. So Germany, a big uncertainty. We don't know what will happen in the future. But okay, let's maybe talk a little bit about Poland, because as we mentioned, okay, we are let's say proud of this last 30 years, but we cannot make some mistakes of other advanced countries, and we cannot stop, right? So the question would be for Poland, like how we can maintain this next 30 years, or the other way, you know, we were the convergence economy, and right now we need to be advanced economy or innovation-led economy. So how that may happen, and maybe also the timing is important here, because geopolitically right now we are kind of frontier of Europe due to war in Ukraine, and from the economic perspective, how we also can make this as an opportunity.
What Poland has done took advantage of low-hanging fruits.
Yeah, for sure.
So in the possibility frontier, Poland was inside. So Poland grew very fast just by getting the low-hanging fruit and imitating what the other people do, setting up the structure, and now you're at the frontier. When you are at the frontier, you cannot keep imitating what other people do. You need to push the frontier, and that's what we call innovation.
Yeah.
And to have innovation, you require entrepreneurs, you require freedom, you require an environment where taking risks is not badly seen. You require an environment where you give enough resources. You have a financial sector in which they are willing to take risk, and we have it open. So these are the elements of the society pushing the frontier, and this pushing the frontier require again economic freedom. So it's very relevant that Poland oppose to all those type of regulations that they are trying, or they have to create this wealth creation process. And Poland until now, because they were in the process of going to the frontier, those regulations were not that much constrained that much the police action.
Yeah.
But now they will start, so they will have to go out and say, hey, we need more space, more freedom on this. Because when you are arriving to the frontier, those things are non-binding. Mm-hmm. But now they are binding. So this is politically wise is a level. Now you mentioned the war, and it's a big thing, because when you see the other countries, they worry about the war, but it's not the main worry about the war. You have it here. So you will be the guys that will be in the front. You will be the guys that will stop the other guys will talk, but it will be difficult push them to put the necessary resources. No, this is a big problem, because you are the guys that are. So this is something that we have to support. NATO conditionality. We have to. I know it's difficult to agree with Donald Trump, but we have to push what Donald Trump say, 5%. France already said 3 or 4 days ago that will expand the nuclear capabilities. That is the thing that has to be done. No, that has to have the whole everybody behind, because this is not a problem of Poland, it's a problem of Europe that they have. The Economist, and this was popular in Spain, the Economist created a graph where they have in the vertical axis the expenditure on defense as percentage of GDP. Okay. And the horizontal axis distance from Moscow. Okay. So they see, the economists say, I can explain you what Spain or Portugal are spending so little. No, okay, of course that is silly. The missiles take 8 minutes to arrive to Madrid. So that is not that is a silly thing. It's the whole Europe has to stop this thing there, and they have to stop it because it's first because of humanitarian. The estimate of death and injury, it's approaching 2 million people. That's something for Russians, the estimates are between 200,000 to 600,000 deaths, which is an incredible thing. United States left Vietnam when they have 50,000 deaths. And now we are talking about a huge. So, in humanitarian sense, it's very costly. Secondly, it's an issue that Europe will have to understand, and this will be difficult, but I think that is important that the Donbass won't come back to be Ukrainian region. Mm-hmm. So that's where but at the same time, one that is accepted, Europe will have to have behind that line to put enough resources. So Putin says, I cannot move forward. And that is something and Poland will be so Poland has to push. So Poland has, at the macro level, too big to try to fight against liberalization, deregulation, because now that will be binding for Poland. Yeah, definitely. And second, to fight because the other guys realize that this is not it's a war in Europe. It's United States might provide nuclear backup, but United States won't put that much money in that war.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting, and I really like this summary that means more liberalization and more economic freedom, because sometimes we feel that closer we are to Brussels, there are less of this economic freedom, and we need to find a good way how to manage all this situation. Because as you mentioned, as we were at the beginning of the road, we probably need this kind of track to move forward. But right now, as we are at this level, we probably can invent many things, but invention means no barriers, because that's invention, right? Yeah. It's interesting. And maybe let me moving a little bit to the final remarks of this discussion. I would also like to ask you two more questions. The first one is about the let's say, mega trends or something related to, you know, these big things that may shape the business strategies over the next 5 or 10 years. Today is, of course, AI, which we can talk in many applications, of course, and we can hear about it all over. But what do you think are top 3 mega trends that should shape business strategies for the next 5-10 years?
Well, technology, AI is the first one, and that will have a profound impact how we do business. We have previous technological progress, but we didn't see a clear increase in productivity among them. That's why this famous Robert Solow phrase, I can see computers everywhere but in the national accountings, because we don't see the benefit of this. But now we're seeing at the micro level improvement in productivity. We see a jump in productivity in the United States in the last 3 years. You know? At the same time, we see, for example, some indication that the hiring of young qualified guys has gone down. So there are many things that are building the puzzle of what will be the impact of AI onto this thing. But it's a substantial, it seems to be that it will be a substantial and very important change in terms of productivity. People say, oh, there is a bubble. Might be a bubble. But the fact that there is a bubble doesn't mean that it doesn't have a productivity. The fact that there is a bubble implies that the market is too optimistic about AI, which is a different thing. And we have a boom and bust in the stock market for railways. We have a boom and bust in the stock market for electricity. Nobody can claim that those technological progress were not substantial. But we have a boom and bust on the stock market because the market was too optimistic about the revenues coming from that. And so the fact that might be a bubble, quote unquote, doesn't mean that we are not facing a substantial economic change. The second one is an aging society everywhere. So we stop dramatically the production of babies in the world.
Yeah.
And this is what is substantial, that we thought that this will happen mostly in high-income economies, but we are seeing that it's spreading out all over the world. So the last 2 years, the number of babies per woman has been only to keep population relatively constant. They are in the world, which is this number is 2.1 in advanced economy, 2.3 in developing countries. No, that babies per woman, and we are going below that number.
Yeah.
There are countries like China that now they are 1.4 billion, and by 2100 they will be 600 million. They will lose more than half of the population. Something similar will happen to Germany. So this is a supply. But there are countries like advanced economies like South Korea that there is today around 1.01 babies per woman, but countries like Chile, that is not advanced, has the same number. So again, it's people stop having, and this will be a profound change in the system.
Yeah, in Poland I can say that it happened almost overnight.
Yes.
We have very young population. It seems like it was yesterday, and right now we are very low fertility rate, around 1.1 or something. Yes. It happens super fast.
Yes, and it's happening in all the countries. So here, if you think in a supply and demand for labor, what's happening is that the supply is moving to the left. So salaries and other things will tend to increase. But at the same time, we have technology that pushing demand down. So that implies we don't know of these two effects. On one hand, technology is substituting people, so the demand for labor is coming down. On the other hand, the supply, it's shifting in because of, so which of these two will be faster? it will imply what will happen with the salaries in advanced economies, essentially. No, the average salary in advanced economies. So this is, and also the problem here is that we have social structures that won't survive like this, like pension system of pay as you go. I'm paying now the guys that are retired in Spain, where I'm paying the retirees because we have an implicit contract that when I retire, the guys that are coming will pay for my retirement. Nobody's coming.
Yeah.
And the guys that are coming don't want to work also. So these are two issues that the system is, so this is a profound impact on that. That will be, so this is the second one. And the third one, I would say that is debt.
Interesting.
We are increasing the debt. If you, the gross debt of the world, it's a silly measure because, of course, we cannot owe money to the Martians. So that's why the gross is very important. But when you eliminate, but that doesn't mean that it's not worrisome anyhow. The gross debt of the world is roughly 250% of GDP.
250, okay.
So this is where deep into debt, countries are increasing debt. So, and the most worrisome debt is the debt of the governments. Are they sustainable or not? So the debt over GDP is very relevant indicator. And that is something that countries will have to manage, not to have a uncontrolled increase on debt over GDP. So economists always are talking about G, which is the rate of growth of GDP, versus R, the interest rate, to see if G is higher than R. If the growth is higher than the interest rate, that won't explode, no? But this is, we have to be very careful about that, because that G and R are usually nominal. So implying that you can make G higher than R by having an explosion of inflation. That's how we manage that. So that is, and I think that is very likely to happen in Europe and in the United States in lesser extent, that the ECB will start buying bonds from the periphery to avoid the demise of France or Spain with a debt over GDP increasing. No? So we won't see times of 2% interest rate, inflation rate, or 3% inflation rate. We're going to 4 to 5% inflation rate.
Okay, so maybe last question, because you touched upon debt, and I think it's an increasing problem in Poland. Because on the one hand side, we have a Goldilocks moment, so stable growth, kind of low inflation, around 3%, and low unemployment rate. But on the other hand side, we see one challenge, which is public finances. We have deficit 7% this year, and debt to GDP moving towards 75% of GDP. And you have a debate about it. On the one hand side, we have, healthcare expenditure, as you mentioned, because of aging population, and of course defense, because we increase our defense spending, doubled. On the other hand side, we see people say this is the increasing debt is very warning. So I'm curious, what you think about it.
Well, debt over GDP of the countries there are four ways to decrease this. One, which is very difficult, increase GDP. Second, slow down the acquire of debt. So move from having a deficit, primary deficit, to primary surplus. The primary means that deficit that you have before paying interest rate. So that is government expenditure versus tax revenue. You have to have. That is very difficult to achieve. And governments, because of the problem of health and all that things, what they tend to do, and we will see in all the countries, and I think including Poland, increasing the tax rate. That's how it's the only way to have the close that G minus T, government expenditure minus revenue. That is so in all the countries. So this is the second way of doing it. The third way is to behave like some countries do it once every 10 years, default. Argentina, I'm Chilean, so I should not say Argentina. Icelandic way, no, you don't pay.
Sorry, say sorry.
Sorry, and then make a line, and we have a haircut, and see. But that have a profound impact on countries, and country like Poland cannot do that. So that is out of the.
Yeah.
And the last one is inflation. So inflation is an implicit default that has been used historically for the countries. That's how we have a huge decline in debt after the Second World War in the United States. So what the government does is pump money into the system and at the same time have something it's called in economic financial repression. So force institutions, financial institutions mostly, to hold bonds with an interest rate very similar to inflation. So the real interest rate, it's almost zero. And that's how it's happened. And if you look what's happened during the pandemic in Poland, part of that what's happened. Banks were forced to hold bonds. Yeah. So this is we call it financial repression.
Should we, at that moment, as Poland, increase our debt and our deficit, or should we? What is your opinion?
The increasing debt and debt, it's very difficult to control. This is a problem that arises because can Poland today say we're not increasing anymore the defense? They are pushed to that. Can in health, there are other things that Poland know now that it was an important expenditure that didn't produce much. For example, what we just talked before, incentive to fertility, didn't produce much.
Yeah.
So we learned the lesson. That's something that it cannot be. So this is other policies are the one that are forced to undertake. So in order to do that, you need to reassess the whole financial sector, public sector, the finance of the public sector, and eliminate subsidies that are not necessary, try to reassess that part. That's politically it's difficult. So what we see is that the inertia of the inflation is there. The inertia, of the deficit is there, and the inertia of the debt is there. So when countries find in that situation is when the inflation is not a bad outcome for this. No? Okay. I'm saying inflation is not a bad outcome I'm from Latin America, so you can see that in Latin America, inflation has been devastating for the countries. So you can play a little bit with this, but if you don't control it, it will balloon, and you don't know where you end up.
Yeah, that's a very important issue. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a very nice discussion. It's really a pleasure to understand a little bit more about the macroeconomic trends, what's happening in the world, and how that's imply Europe and also Poland. Thank you very much, Professor. It was really a pleasure. And thank you for your time, and see you in our next series.
Bye-bye. Thank you.